You owe us. Your father is retiring, and it's your duty to pay. Give us the money and repent for your sins. It's the only way I'll ever forgive you.
I looked at the message from my cousin and felt nothing but a cold, clinical amusement. My mother had told her that she was finally ready to forgive me for being gay, provided I put in the work to repent. Then came the real punchline. My father wants to retire, and they expect me to financially support them because, in her words, that is a daughter's job. I didn't scream or cry. I simply tilted my phone toward the light and whispered to the empty room, "So, my existence is a sin, but my money is sanctified? I don't think so, Mother." 10 years ago, my father beat me and threatened to bury my body in the backyard after finding out I was gay. My mother watched and called me a pervert before throwing me onto the streets with nothing but the clothes on my back. For a decade, they told the world I was a drug addict who ran away with a predator. But now, the family is in absolute shambles. One brother is in prison, another is gone, and my sisters are destroying each other's lives. Suddenly, my mother is ready to forgive me. Not because she's sorry, but because my father wants to retire and they need a piggy bank. They think I'm still that scared 19-year-old girl. They have no idea that I've spent the last 10 years building a life they aren't invited to. If your parents threw you out like trash, then asked for your life savings 10 years later, would you even pick up the phone? If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would forgive them for the sake of family, or type 2 or B if you would let them face the consequences of their own actions. Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because what I did next changed everything. I remember the exact temperature of the living room on the night my life as I knew it ended. It was 74 degrees, but my skin felt like it was being pressed against dry ice. My breathing was shallow, rhythmic, and entirely controlled. I didn't cry. Even then, at 19, I knew that tears were a currency my parents didn't value. My father's face was a shade of deep, bruised purple, a color I had only ever seen on rotting fruit. In his right hand, he held my phone. The screen was cracked, but the text messages were still legible. Messages to a girl I loved, messages that, in his mind, were an invitation for a death sentence. "You are a pervert," he whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to choke on. He didn't scream at first. He just stood there, his chest heaving under his flannel shirt. "You are a disgusting, predatory pervert. Do you have any idea what you've brought into this house?" I looked at my mother. She wasn't looking at me. She was meticulously smoothing the wrinkles out of a lace doily on the coffee table. Her movements were precise, clinical. She looked up only once, her eyes as cold as 2 glass marbles. "I have no daughter," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was flat, a simple statement of fact, like reciting a grocery list. "I have 5 children. I do not have a pervert under my roof." Then came the violence. It was sudden, but I experienced it in slow motion. I felt the impact of my father's fist against my jaw, a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a bag of flour hitting the floor. I fell, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth almost instantly. He didn't stop. He dragged me toward the back door by my hair. "If I ever see your face again," he spat, his breath smelling of stale coffee and unbridled rage, "I will kill you. I'll kill you and bury your body in the backyard. I'll get away with it too. Everyone knows what you are. No one will look for a girl like you." He threw me onto the porch. My shoulder hit the wooden railing with a sharp crack, the sound of a dry branch breaking. I lay there, looking up at the porch light, watching the moths flutter mindlessly against the bulb. My mother appeared in the doorway for a brief second. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a coat. She simply threw my sneakers onto the gravel driveway. "Repent," she said. "Maybe one day God will forgive you. But I am finished with you." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a final metallic snap. I stood up, my knees shaking, my jaw throbbing with a rhythmic pulse that matched the ticking of my watch. I had exactly $24 in my pocket and the clothes on my back. I didn't look back at the house. I walked toward the street, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. the only sound in a neighborhood that had suddenly become a graveyard. I was 19. I was homeless. And for the first time in my life, I was finally, terrifyingly free. For the first year after the deadbolt clicked shut, I lived in the spaces between shadows. I slept in a car that smelled of stale fries and old upholstery, and I worked 3 jobs that required me to be invisible. But while I was building a floor beneath my feet, my parents were busy building a monument of lies. I know this because of my cousin, Sarah. She was the only one who didn't look at me like I was a contagion. Through her, I heard the fables they crafted. In their version of the story, I didn't get dragged out by my hair. No. In their version, I was a lost soul who ran away in the middle of the night with a predatory older woman. They told the congregation at their church that I was a high-functioning drug addict, a pervert who had to be removed for the safety of the neighborhood. "Your mom tells everyone you're living in a den of sin," Sarah told me over a static-filled phone call 6 years ago. "She sighs and wipes a fake tear every time someone asks about you. She's turned her grief into a personality trait. It's a performance, and she's winning the Oscar." I didn't argue. I didn't call the neighbors to defend my honor. Instead, I opened my laptop and focused on the only thing that couldn't be manipulated by a self-righteous mother: data. I worked in cybersecurity and digital forensics. While they were busy talking, I was busy becoming a ghost who owned her own home and had a credit score of 820. I learned to find peace in the silence. I learned that a family that loves a lie more than their own child isn't a family, it's a cult of 2. For 10 years, I heard nothing from them directly. No happy birthday texts. No are you alive? Emails. Just the distant echo of their whispers, painting me as the villain in a play I was no longer acting in. I was at peace. I had a garden that actually grew. I had a life that was quiet, expensive, and mine. But as the saying goes, the truth doesn't need to be loud to eventually shatter a glass house. And my parents' house? It wasn't just made of glass. It was made of thin, brittle ice, and the sun was finally starting to rise. The silence of a decade didn't break with a bang. It broke with a soft ping on my encrypted messaging app. It was Sarah. She didn't send a greeting. She sent a link to a local news article and a series of scanned legal documents. I sat in my office, the city lights reflecting off the mahogany surface of my desk. I scrolled through the data with the same detached precision I used to hunt for malware. The godly family I had been kicked out of was no longer a house of cards. It was a heap of ash. My older brother, the golden son who could do no wrong, had passed away from an overdose 6 months ago. My parents hadn't even bothered to tell me. They were too busy hiding the shame. Then there was my other brother, the one they defended when he was accused of predatory behavior, now sitting in a state penitentiary. And the sisters? A chaotic web of betrayals. One was pregnant with the other's husband, and the other had been arrested for trying to run him over in a parking lot. The irony was thick enough to taste. For 10 years, they had painted me as the pervert and the addict to protect their image. Yet in my absence, they had become exactly what they accused me of being. Their moral high ground had eroded into a swamp. "They're broke, my name," Sarah's text read. "Your dad's pension was wiped out by legal fees for your brother. Your mom is desperate. She thinks if she forgives you, you'll feel guilty enough to sign over your house. She actually told my mom that you should be honored to support them after all the grief you caused." I leaned back, watching a single raindrop trail down the window pane. I didn't feel smug. I felt a cold, hard clarity. They didn't want a daughter. They didn't even want a repentant sinner. They wanted a forensic accountant with a deep pocket and a short memory. They were drowning in a mess of their own making, and they expected me to be the life raft. But they forgot one thing. They were the ones who taught me how to swim away from a sinking ship. The formal outreach didn't come as a phone call. My mother knew I wouldn't answer. Instead, she sent a long, meticulously typed email through my cousin, framed as a manifesto of grace. I read it while sitting in my kitchen, the only sound being the low, rhythmic hum of my refrigerator. I had a cup of black coffee in my hand, No sugar, no cream. My grip on the ceramic was steady. "My dearest daughter," the email began. I paused. The word daughter felt like a foreign object in my mouth, sharp and metallic. "I have spent many nights in prayer. I have decided that life is too short for bitterness. I am ready to forgive you for the choices you made that broke our family. I am ready to open my arms and guide you back to a path of righteousness." I scrolled down. The guidance didn't take long to reveal its price tag. "Your father's health is not what it used to be," she wrote. "He is forced to retire this year, and as you know, the family resources have been depleted. We have calculated that a monthly stipend of $4,000 would allow us to keep the house and maintain a modest life. It is a daughter's holy duty to honor her parents. By doing this, you will prove your repentance is sincere. We are giving you a chance to earn your place back in this family." I didn't blink. I analyzed the text as if I were looking for a security breach. It was a classic case of Darvo: deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. She had denied the assault and the homelessness. She had attacked my character for a decade. And now, she was the merciful victim offering me a path to salvation through my bank account. She had even attached a budget, a PDF titled Retirement Needs. I opened it. It was a list of demands: property taxes, country club dues, and miscellaneous expenses. There was no mention of the brother who died, no mention of the brother in prison, just a list of numbers that she expected me to subsidize. I looked at the total monthly line at the bottom. It was exactly 40% of what they had assumed a successful person in my field would make. I set the phone down on the granite countertop. The silence in my penthouse felt expansive, luxurious. My mother's forgiveness was a product she was trying to sell me, but she had failed to realize I was no longer in the market for her brand of poison. She thought she was opening a door. She didn't realize I had already built a wall, and the foundation was reinforced with 10 years of her own silence. I printed the PDF. The sound of my laser printer was a rhythmic, professional hum in the quiet of my home office. As the warm pages slid into the tray, I picked them up with steady fingers. I didn't need a highlighter to see the audacity dripping from every line. I sat back in my leather chair, the city skyline behind me a blur of amber and violet, and began to audit the life of the man who had promised to bury me in his backyard. The document was titled Family Restoration and Retirement Security. It was 6 pages long. My mother had always been fond of bureaucracy. She used it to mask her cruelty. The breakdown was specific. They were asking for a recurring monthly transfer of $4,000, but there was also an initial reinstatement fee of $15,000. Apparently, according to my mother's math, that was the cost of cleaning the house of the spiritual stain I had left behind 10 years ago. I scanned the leisure and wellness section for my father. $1,200 a month for a premium country club membership, $700 for medical supplements not covered by his dwindling insurance, and then the kicker, a line item for home security upgrades. I leaned closer to the page. They wanted me to pay for a high-end surveillance system for the very house I was dragged out of by my hair. They wanted me to protect them from a world they claimed I was the rot of. I pulled up my own records on the second monitor. I looked at my diversified portfolio, my high-yield savings, and the deed to my penthouse. Then, I cross-referenced the data Sarah had sent me. My father wasn't just retiring, he was being forced out. His company had undergone a restructuring, and because of his documented history of volatile temper with junior staff, they were letting him go with the bare minimum. His pension had been decimated by the legal fees for my brother in prison and the hush money they had unsuccessfully tried to pay the woman my other brother had defrauded. They were broke, not just spiritually, but numerically. I looked at the total amount they were expecting over the next 20 years. It came to nearly $1 million. They were asking for $1 million apology for the crime of me being born the way I was. I took a sip of my coffee. It was cold now. I didn't mind. Cold things are easier to measure. 40%, I whispered to the room. They had calculated that I should give them 40% of my estimated income. They had clearly been stalking my LinkedIn profile, tracking my promotions, and estimating my salary based on industry standards. They hadn't reached out because they missed me. They had reached out because they had done a cost-benefit analysis of my existence and decided I was finally worth something. The phone on my desk vibrated. A text from Sarah. "Your mom is telling the aunties that you've already agreed. She says you're weeping with gratitude for the chance to come home. She's already picked out new furniture for the guest room with your money." I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the cold, sharp edge of a surgical blade. My mother wasn't just asking for money, she was selling a narrative. She was telling the world that she had successfully broken me, that I had crawled back on my hands and knees, checkbook in hand, to beg for a seat at a table that had never been mine. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city was a grid of light and movement, a complex system where everything had a price. My parents had set their price. They thought they were the ones holding the ledger. They forgot that in the world of digital forensics, the person who controls the data controls the outcome. I walked back to my desk and opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it, "The Cost of 10 Years." I began to input the numbers. The cost of the dental work I needed after my father hit me. The cost of the nights I spent sleeping in a car with $24 in my pocket. The cost of the therapy required to stop me from flinching every time a door slammed. When I was finished, the total was far higher than $1 million. My mother wanted a daughter's holy duty. I was going to give her a professional's clinical response. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to send her a bill. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of flow. As a digital forensics specialist, I don't look for emotions. I look for patterns. Patterns don't lie. Patterns don't hide behind scripture or motherly love. I pulled up the public property records for my childhood home. Foreclosure notices had been filed 3 months ago. The retirement my father wanted wasn't a choice, it was a collapse. I sat there, my fingers dancing across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic, metallic click-clack that echoed in the vastness of my living room. I didn't just look at their debts, I looked at their public image. I found the social media posts my mother had been making. Photos of her at church, smiling, captioned with, "Praying for my lost sheep to return home." The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the air. She was selling the narrative of the grieving mother while privately sending me an invoice for my own existence. I paused, my hand hovering over the mouse. I looked at the family restoration PDF again. $1 million over 20 years. That was the price of a seat at a table where I'd likely still be called a pervert over Sunday dinner. If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would swallow your pride, pay the money, and try to have a family again. Type 2 or B if you would let the foreclosure happen and keep your peace. Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now because what I did next changed everything. I didn't choose option A. I didn't even choose to just ignore them. I opened a new file and began to compile the counter-manifesto. I pulled the police report from my brother's arrest. I pulled the toxicology report from my other brother's passing, the one they tried to bury. I pulled the marriage license of my sister and the divorce filing of the other, documenting the exact dates of the betrayal that had shattered their godly household. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it for the 19-year-old girl who had been thrown onto a gravel driveway in the dark. I was doing it to prove that you cannot demand holy duty from someone you treated like unholy trash. The final piece of the puzzle was a recording Sarah had sent me. It was a voice memo of my mother talking to her sisters at a brunch last week. "She'll pay," my mother's voice crackled through my high-end speakers. "She's lonely. Those people always are. She has no one else. She'll pay the $15,000 just to see us again, and once she starts, she won't stop. It's the least she can do after the shame she brought on this family." I didn't flinch. I didn't even feel my heart rate accelerate. I simply highlighted the file, labeled it Evidence of Intent, and moved it into a folder titled The Final Audit. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. The city below was silent, but my mind was a hum of clinical execution. I reached for my phone and did something I hadn't done in 3,650 days. I unblocked my mother's number. I didn't call her. Not yet. I waited for the silence to settle, for the weight of her own lies to ripen. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, a daughter's response, but it wouldn't be written in tears. It would be written in the language of a woman who had learned that the only way to deal with a shark is to drain the tank. I waited until exactly 9 a.m. the following morning. I wanted her to be awake, caffeinated, and fully prepared for the victory she believed was coming. I sat at my dining table, a glass of ice water in front of me. I watched the condensation form a perfect ring on the coaster. My heart rate was a steady 64 beats per minute. I was not a daughter looking for a mother. I was a creditor closing a bad account. I pressed the call button. It didn't even ring twice before she picked up. "I knew you'd call," she said. Her voice was pitched high, vibrating with a forced, sugary warmth that made my skin crawl. "I told your father you'd find your way back to us. I could feel the Holy Spirit working on your heart. Have you read the proposal, dear?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, long and uncomfortable, until the only sound was the faint, rhythmic scratching of her breathing on the other end of the line. I took a slow sip of my water, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass, a sharp, metallic sound in the stillness of my penthouse. "I read it, Mother," I said. My voice was flat, level, devoid of any inflection. "I read every single word. I also listened to the voice memo you sent to Aunt Martha yesterday, the one where you called me a lonely sheep who would pay $15,000 just for the privilege of seeing your face." The silence on the other end became absolute. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator realizing it had stepped into a trap. I could almost hear the gears turning as she tried to calculate a response. "Now, let's talk about numbers," I continued, my voice remaining clinical. "You've requested a total of $1 million over 20 years. You've also requested $15,000 up front for a spiritual cleaning of a house that currently has a foreclosure notice taped to the front door. Case number 48279 in the county records, filed 92 days ago. Your husband, the man who threatened to bury my body in the backyard, is being forced into retirement due to a history of workplace aggression. Your golden son is dead from a shame you tried to hide, and your other son is inmate number 7045 in the state penitentiary." "How dare you?" she started, her voice cracking, the sugary mask slipping to reveal the jagged edges of her rage. "I am not finished," I said, my tone as cold as the ice in my glass. "You told the world I was a drug addict and a pervert. You let me sleep in a car when I was 19 while you smoothing out doilies in a house you can no longer afford. You didn't reach out because you forgave me. You reached out because you ran out of people to lie to, and I am the only one left with a bank account large enough to save you from your own failures." I leaned back, looking out at the city skyline. A bird flew past the window, its wings silent against the glass. "The answer is no," I said. "I will not be paying the $15,000. I will not be paying the $4,000 a month. I will not be subsidizing a country club membership for a man who hasn't apologized for hitting me 10 years ago. In fact, I've already contacted the bank holding your mortgage. As a specialist in digital forensics, I found the inconsistencies in the financial statements you submitted for your last loan modification. If I were to hand those over to the forensic auditors, the foreclosure would be the least of your worries." I heard a sharp, jagged intake of breath on the other end. You're threatening your own mother? After everything I've done for you?" "I am stating facts," I replied. "You taught me that my existence was a sin. I'm simply agreeing with you. If I am as disgusting and evil as you've claimed for a decade, then surely you wouldn't want to touch a single cent of my perverted money. It would be a stain on your godly household, wouldn't it?" I didn't wait for her to play the victim. I didn't wait for the tears or the screaming or the Darvo spin that I knew was coming. I hung up. The silence returned to the room, but it felt different now. It felt lighter. I placed the phone face down on the table. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked at the ring of water on the coaster and wiped it away with a napkin until the surface was clean, dry, and empty. I had spent 10 years waiting for their forgiveness. I realized now that the only forgiveness I ever needed was my own, forever believing I owed them anything at all. The aftermath of a bridge burning is rarely silent. It's filled with the sound of snapping cables and the frantic splashes of those who thought they could walk on water. Within 30 minutes of hanging up, my phone began to vibrate against the marble countertop. It wasn't my mother. She was too smart to leave a recorded trail of her rage after I'd mentioned forensic auditors. Instead, the notifications started pouring in from Sarah. I sat on my balcony, watching the city breathe below me. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of rain and distant exhaust. I didn't open the messages immediately. I watched a silver sedan navigate a tight turn 3 stories down, its blinker clicking in a steady, mindless rhythm. Only when I had finished my water did I pick up the device. "She's losing it," Sarah's first text read. She called my mom sobbing. She told everyone you've become a cold-blooded monster who is actively trying to make them homeless. She's telling the aunties that you threatened to put your father in prison. I scrolled further. There were screenshots of a group chat I had been purged from a decade ago. My mother was performing for her audience, her typing speed clearly fueled by panic. She was using all the keywords: betrayal, ungrateful, sin, elder abuse. She sent a photo of your father sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, Sarah added. She's framing it as if you're the one who caused the foreclosure. She's asking for a family intervention to shame you into doing the right thing. I leaned back, my eyes tracing the clean, sharp lines of my balcony railing. The manipulation was so predictable it was almost boring. She wasn't fighting for her daughter. She was fighting for the narrative that allowed her to sleep at night. If I was the monster, then her failures, the debts, the broken children, the violent husband weren't her fault. They were just the cross she had to bear because of me. I didn't engage with the group. I didn't send a long emotional defense. Instead, I opened the folder on my cloud drive titled The Final Audit. I selected 3 files: the recorded voice memo of her brunch confession, the PDF of the retirement needs invoice she had sent me, and a scanned copy of the foreclosure notice. I sent them to Sarah with a single instruction: if they want an intervention, give them the data, don't argue. Just show them the price tag she put on her forgiveness. For the next hour, I did something my mother would never understand. I went back to work. I reviewed a line of code for a client in Zurich. I tracked a series of suspicious IP addresses originating from a server in Eastern Europe. My pulse remained a steady 65. My world was built on logic, on things that could be proven or patched. Her world was built on shadows and guilt, and shadows disappear when you turn on a high-powered light. At 11:45 p.m., Sarah called. Her voice was breathless, a mixture of shock and a strange, dark satisfaction. "It's over," she whispered. "I dropped the files into the family chat right after your mom finished a 3-paragraph rant about your greed." The room went dead. I mean, total silence. Aunt Martha asked her point blank if the $15,000 cleaning fee was real. Your mom tried to say it was for repairs, but then Martha pointed out the line in the PDF that specifically called it a spiritual reinstatement fee. "And my father?" I asked. He tried to take the phone and scream at Martha, but she hung up on him. The aunties are starting to realize that the drug addict daughter they've been pitying for 10 years is actually the only one in the family with a career, and the only one who actually has the facts. You didn't just defend yourself, you dismantled her entire altar. I stared out at the dark horizon. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who would have given anything for one of those aunties to speak up for her a decade ago. I thought about the sneakers landing on the gravel and the sound of the deadbolt. "They'll try one more time," I said. "When the bank actually comes for the keys, they'll move from righteous anger to pathetic desperation. It's the only card they have left." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to do exactly what they told the world I did 10 years ago," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the glass-walled room. "I'm going to stay away, only this time It's not because I was kicked out, it's because I finally realized that the house was never actually a home. It was just a stage, and the show is finally over. I hung up and put my phone on Do Not Disturb. I walked into my bedroom, the silk sheets cool against my skin. I didn't dream of gravel or violent fathers. I slept the deep, heavy sleep of someone who had balanced the books and found that, for the first time in 10 years, she didn't owe a single cent to anyone. The end of a decade-long war didn't arrive with a grand surrender. It arrived with a series of frantic, distorted voicemails that I listened to while sitting in my car, parked outside a high-end gallery where I was about to purchase a piece of art for my foyer. The juxtaposition was almost poetic. Inside the building, there was curated beauty and quiet wealth. On my phone, there was the sound of a legacy turning to dust. The first voicemail was from my father. His voice, once a booming instrument of terror that could make the floorboards vibrate, was thin and reedy. It was the sound of a man who had realized that his threats of backyard burials were useless against a daughter who held his mortgage in her digital hands. "Listen," he stammered, the background noise of a television blaring a news program filling the silence between his words. I shouldn't have said those things back then. Your mother, she's in a state. The bank was here this morning. They gave us 30 days. They're taking the house, my name, everything. We have nowhere to go. You have that big place in the city. You're our daughter. You can't let your own father sleep on the street. It's not right." I didn't feel the surge of pity he was fishing for. I didn't even feel the heat of old anger. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I wondered if he remembered the weight of his fist against my jaw, or the way the gravel felt against my palms when he threw me out. I wondered if he realized that he was asking for the very shelter he had denied a 19-year-old girl with $24 in her pocket. I deleted the message. The second voicemail was from my mother. The sugary mask was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged desperation. "You've ruined everything," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous rasp. "You showed those files to Martha. You turned the whole family against us. No one will take my calls. No one will help with the move. If we end up in a shelter, it's on your hands. I hope you're happy in your fancy apartment, knowing your parents are starving. May God have mercy on your soul, because I never will." I looked at the glass doors of the gallery. My reflection looked back at me, sharp, professional, and entirely unbothered. I reached into my bag, pulled out a silver fountain pen, and noted a single thought in my journal. Guilt is the last weapon of the powerless. I didn't call them back. I didn't send a check. Instead, I sent a final email to my cousin Sarah. I attached a list of local social services, homeless shelters, and low-income housing applications. "Send this to them," I wrote. "It's a list of the resources I had to find for myself when I was 19. I've highlighted the ones that are particularly helpful for people who have been abandoned by their families. It's more than they ever gave me." The silence that followed my final action was profound. For 10 years, I had been the pervert, the addict, the shame. Now I was simply the one who had survived. I realized then that my parents didn't hate my lifestyle. They hated my independence. They hated that they couldn't control the woman I had become, so they tried to destroy the girl I used to be. I walked into the gallery. The air inside was cool, filtered, and smelled of expensive paper and silence. I spent 45 minutes discussing the brushwork of a landscape piece with the curator. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't mention the foreclosure. I spoke about light, composition, and the importance of a strong foundation. As I signed the bill of sale for $22,000, nearly the exact amount of the spiritual reinstatement fee my mother had demanded, I felt a quiet, clicking sensation in my chest. It was the sound of a debt being settled. Not a debt I owed them, but a debt I owed myself. I was no longer the victim of their story. I was the architect of my own. The house on the gravel driveway was gone. The parents who lived there were ghosts. And as I stepped back out into the bright, clinical light of the city, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, the air didn't taste like blood. It tasted like nothing at all. And that was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. A month passed. In the world of digital forensics, a month is an eternity of data. In the world of family trauma, it is barely a heartbeat. I spent that time in a state of quiet productivity. I didn't check the family group chats. I didn't look for updates on social media. I simply existed in the space I had built for myself, a space defined by clean lines, high-speed fiber optic connections, and a total absence of shouting. The finality of the situation arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my living room, watching the sunlight hit the new landscape painting I had purchased. The colors were vibrant, deep greens and earthy browns, a stark contrast to the sterile, gray environment I had occupied for so long. I opened my laptop one last time to check the property records for my childhood home. Address, 142 Oak Street. Status, sold. Sale price, $342,000. It was a fire sale. The bank had moved quickly. I watched the digital cursor blink on the screen, a tiny, rhythmic heartbeat of data. That house was the place where I had learned to hide who I was. It was the place where the sound of a heavy footstep on the stairs meant I had to brace for impact. Now, it belonged to a family of 4 from out of state. They would probably paint the walls, rip up the gravel driveway, and plant a garden that actually flourished. The ghosts of my father's threats and my mother's doilies would be scrubbed away with a few gallons of primer and a power washer. Sarah sent me one final text later that afternoon. "They're in a 1-bedroom rental on the edge of town," she wrote. "Your dad is working part-time as a security guard. Your mom is telling everyone who will listen that you've been brainwashed by the city. She still carries the retirement needs PDF in her purse, like it's a legal contract you haven't signed yet. She's waiting for you to realize your mistake." I didn't reply. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the hollow ache of regret. What I felt was something far more powerful. Indifference. Indifference is the ultimate luxury. It is the moment you realize that the person who once had the power to destroy your world is now just a stranger with a bad attitude and a dwindling bank account. My mother's forgiveness was a currency that had been devalued to 0. My father's violence was a fire that had finally run out of oxygen. I closed the laptop lid. The metallic clink was the only sound in the room. I thought about the 19-year-old girl on the gravel driveway. I wished I could go back and tell her that the blood in her mouth wouldn't taste like copper forever. I wished I could tell her that honor thy father and mother doesn't mean be a victim for thy father and mother. A daughter's job is not to be a sacrifice at the altar of her parents' failures. A daughter's job is to build a life so full, so stable, and so authentic that the shadows of the past have nowhere left to hide. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was bustling below, millions of people moving through their own dramas, their own calculations. I was just one of them now, but I was the one who had kept my receipts. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the window pane. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I was simply waiting for the sunset. And for the first time in 10 years, I knew exactly who would be there to watch it with me. Me, just me. And that was more than enough. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Choosing peace over toxic blood is a path many people walk in silence, but you don't have to walk it alone. I read every single one of your comments, and your stories of resilience inspire me to keep sharing mine. If you found strength in this story, you won't believe the lengths another family went to when they tried to steal a secret inheritance from a woman they thought was too weak to fight back. You can find that story in the link below. It's a drama you don't want to miss. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I'll see you in the next one.